After I made that lore facts video, I got a fair few comments about people wanting to get into the lore but not knowing how to go about it or where to start. Seeing as how I think the lore is the most underrated part of the game and want more people to get into it, I decided to make this video. To make it less overwhelming to watch, I've split the video into different chapters for different stories and significant events. Before I get started, I want to tell you the overriding rule of League lore. You will always, and I mean always, enjoy the lore more when you're reading it for your favorite champions. Regardless of what I say in this video, start off with the lore of your main or a character you're genuinely interested in. Because I'll admit it, reading is fucking boring sometimes, and forcing yourself to read stories you don't really care about will make it even more excruciating. Like, yeah, some characters have more important lore than others, but if you couldn't care less about that champion, you're not going to enjoy reading it. You're not missing out on anything reading it this way either. It's actually designed to be consumed like this, because every champion's bio has a small mention of a major event or another character, which is supposed to lead you on and make you want to read more. Also, I'd give up on trying to read the lore in chronological order, because you'd have better luck trying to read Shakespeare backwards in Latin than trying to figure that shit out. The world of Runeterra can be very intimidating to get into, and I think this is in large part to the fact that there is no coherent chronological story. It's a bunch of small microverses which have their own timelines, but in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of tricky to know where it all lands. This separates the chronology into historical events well in the past, like the Darkin Wars or the Rune Wars, and then there are things happening now, but we don't know about their conclusion or how they're progressing. We just know that it's going on, like the Mage Rebellion or Azir's Resurrection. Now, let's get into it. I'm gonna list out some stories that I believe to be the most important, not just because of their impact on the overall world, but because of how many champions are tied to it and the historical context they establish. I'm gonna start off with my favorite concept in all of Runeterra, the Darkin. The fall of Icathia and the Void being unleashed is arguably one of the most important events in the history of Runeterra, tied with Lysandra and the Watchers, but I'll get into that later. The fall of Icathia is important because it serves as a catalyst for the stories of so many champions and future events. If you want to know more about the Darkin and the fall of Icathia, the best place to start is the story Where Icathia Once Stood and Twilight of the Gods. Without spoiling too much, Where Icathia Once Stood is about the exact moment when the Void was released on Runeterra. The second most important thing about this story is that it gives a lot of background on what the Darkin were before they became Darkin. Also, it introduces a few lore-only characters whose names you're gonna see pop up a lot while reading about the Darkin, so it's best to start here. After that, I'd recommend reading Twilight of the Gods. This story serves as an unofficial sequel to Where Icathia Once Stood, and explains the Darkin Wars, which was the immediate aftermath of the fall of Icathia, and how the Darkin got sealed into their weapons, and why Aatrox hates Zoe so much. As for champions tied to Darkin, obviously all the Darkin champions like Varus, Kayn, and Aatrox are a great place to start. Aatrox specifically is integral to the whole thing, so reading his bio and any of his color stories is highly recommended if you want to learn about Darkin. If you want to know more about Darkin aside from the ones in League like Aatrox, Varus, and Rast, Legends of Runeterra introduced like 10 in the latest expansion. Even though there isn't much story behind a lot of them, they have really cool designs and give really sick world building. To finish off the Darkin segment, kind of related to Legends of Runeterra, The Faceless God is a story about one of the most important Darkin who isn't mentioned in League, Zolani. One of the biggest events in the world which happened relatively recently within the lifetimes of a lot of the champions is the Noxian invasion of Ionia. The tricky part about the invasion is that there are so many champions tied to it, it's hard to know where to start. So realistically, you could read any Ionian champion's bio to learn more about it, because the majority of them are connected to it in some way or another. If you want to find out the reason behind the invasion, Swain's bio is the best place to start. Reading about Swain has a double effect of being tied to Irelia, so you can read either of these champions' bio to learn about the invasion from different perspectives. If you want to learn more about modern day Noxus and Swain after the invasion, or just curious about Noxus, The Principles of Strength and The Winterspike Road are great stories that show how the Noxian Empire operates. The thing about the invasion of Ionia though is that unlike the Darkin and the Void, there isn't one big story that highlights what led to it and how it kind of played out. Rather, it's spread across different champions' bios and color stories. This is because the invasion is significant, not because of certain events that happened, but because of the effect it had on the people involved in it. A prime example of this is the Sisterhood of War series. This is one of the best series of stories on Universe, and delves the deepest into what happened during the Noxian invasion, and more importantly, the aftermath. If you're interested in Riven and the invasion, I'd highly recommend reading this series of stories. Even if you're not, you should read it, it's an absolute banger. Speaking of Riven, it's impossible to talk about her without talking about Yasuo. If you want to learn about Yasuo and Riven's ties to each other, read Yasuo's bio and then the Confessions of a Broken Blade Part 1 and 2. For the record, these are set an undisclosed amount of time before the Sisterhood of War series. Before we leave Ionia, one last thing we have to talk about is Yone and the Spirit Blossom Festival. For this, Perennial is a perfect prequel story. It shows the aftermath of the Noxian invasion, explains why the Spirit Blossom Festival in 2020 in particular was so important that it got all these stories around it and an entire in-game event, and also explains the first cinematic. If you're curious about the origins of things in Runeterra, arguably the most most important region history-wise is Targon. Everything that happens in Runeterra is somewhat related to Targon. For Targon, I'd recommend reading Aurelian Soul's bio and stories, or just Bard and Soraka's bios. This is because they explain the Celestials the best without being too confusing. Leona, Diana, and Aphelios' bios and stories outline the Solari-Lunari conflict the best, and Pantheon and Taric are a good start if you want to learn more about the aspects. Moving up north, I mentioned Lysandra and the Watchers earlier. The Watchers in the Freljord are the biggest threat on Runeterra at the moment. To learn about the Watchers, there's a story called The Legend of the Frozen Watchers, which details everything pretty well. Reading everything else listed under Lysandra's page on Universe will give you a very good understanding of the history of the modern day Freljord. Also, it explains the origins behind the three major tribes in the Freljord: Ashe's Avarosans, Sejuani's Winter's Claw, and Lysandra's Frostguard. If you're an Aram Andy, you'll definitely want to check this out. Ashe and Sejuani are arguably the most important characters in the Freljord, tied with Lysandra and Udyr. To learn about their backstory and their relationship with each other, the War Mother comic is an absolute must-read. For insight into what Sejuani's up to nowadays, Silence for the Damned and Dead of Winter shows Sejuani trying to keep the Winter's Claw alive. Also, Dead of Winter is a prequel to the Call cinematic, which is pretty neat. If you're interested in the origins of the Freljord itself, Ord and Volibear are your go-tos. Their bios and color stories outline it pretty well. The last major past event is the Rune Wars. Rise is your one-stop shop if you want to know anything about the Rune Wars. Demacia is also heavily connected to it, so Kale and Poppy's bios serve as a pretty good history lesson. Speaking of Demacia, if you want to know about the Mage Rebellion, the Lux comic is the easiest way to get caught up. After that, everything under Salas's page on Universe is good. Salas's stories explain the rebel side of the conflict really well, but if you're interested in the Demacian side, both of Xin Zhao's color stories, What Once Sailed Free and Aftermath, are what you're after. Now that I've covered the major events that are mentioned most often, I'm just gonna list some stories which I think are the best and you should read. Camille, in my opinion, has the best lore in the game, so I'd recommend reading her bio, then the Severed Ties comic, and then the Weakest Heart story. I say this as if reading the comic is some kind of chore, but the story and art in the comic are absolutely beautiful. You're not gonna regret reading it first. The short story, which takes an hour to read, is a direct sequel to the comic, so you'll enjoy the story more if you read the comic first. Personally, I think it's the best canon story on Universe, and I won't spoil too much, but be ready to bawl your eyes out because this shit is a depression any percent speedrun. After Camille's story, the Shen, Zed, and Jin saga is also really good and one of my personal favorites. This is because the Zed comic is an absolute masterpiece and it's the best out of the three that they released, in my opinion. But it's the last piece of the saga, so to get the most out of it, you can do a little homework. I'd recommend reading all three of their bios, and then the short story, The Man with the Steel Cane, and then read the comic. You don't have to do this in this order because, like I said, you can read the lore in any order you want, but this is the best order if you want to go into the comic knowing everything you need to know beforehand. Now, I'm gonna go through some champions whose lore I'd avoid reading. Corki, Cho'Gath, Shaco, and Kog'Maw are some of the few remaining champions who haven't gotten a lore update in a stupid amount of time. They have less lines of text combined than Akshan's passive, and I wish that was a joke. That's pretty much it. Anything else that I say in this category is very subjective. In my opinion, I find the lore of all the post-Ruination champions kind of boring and uninspired. These champions include Zeri, Renata, Neela, Cassante, and Milio, with Bel'Veth being the exception. But for more on that, you can go watch this video I made, which goes deep into exactly why I believe this is the case. To quickly touch on Legends of Runeterra, nowadays it's pretty confusing because there's a lot of crazy shit going on in the cards that get released, but there's barely a mention of it on Universe. So treat everything you read on there as a what-if scenario rather than canon events. Also, the alternate universes are really fun to read through, but their lore gets like zero support from Riot, so trying to piece together the story is kinda hard, but I think it's pretty fun. But at the same time, I really don't like that format of releasing skins and using the flavor text as the main way to promote the story. Before I wrap up, let me just reiterate, the stories and champions that I mentioned are important, but the underlying rule still applies. Read the lore of the champions you're interested in rather than reading what's important. That way you're gonna want to read more rather than feel like you have to read it to understand. Bear in mind that there are other major events that I didn't cover. The ones I mentioned are just the ones that get mentioned the most. Thank you so much for watching, like and subscribe, and let me know which champions you think have the best lore and which one's your personal favorite. And send this video to Necrit, please notice me, daddy.